Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I would like to thank Coptic Solidarity for inviting me to join you this morning. I probably should point out at the outset, since in the introduction it was mentioned that I had worked for George McGovern, and my last name is McGovern. We're actually not related. People always come up to me and tell me they were longtime supporters of my dad, and they seem a little shocked when I say that my dad owns a liquor store in Massachusetts, and please keep on supporting him. Anyway, but it is especially important to me to be here today in light of the string of horrific attacks carried out against Coptic Christians in Egypt in recent months. The bombing of the St. Peter and St. Paul's Church in Cairo, the twin Palm Sunday suicide bombings at St. George's Church in Tanta and St. Mark's Church in Alexandria, the recent attack on a busload of Coptic pilgrims on their way to Samuel Monastery. These three attacks are the most notorious that have occurred, but as we all know, hundreds more Coptic Christians have been killed in sectarian clashes since 2011. The so-called Islamic State claimed responsibility for all three. Now, let's be clear what it means to claim responsibility, because sometimes that language seems sanitized. To claim responsibility is to publicly admit to intentional murder. Now, I want to assure you that I stand with you in the aftermath of these attacks. I support your calls for accountability, beginning with transparent investigations, and for an independent UN inquiry to evaluate the situation of the Coptic people in Egypt. Just as important going forward, I support your calls for prevention. Prevention is much more than bombing suspected militant bases after an attack takes place. Prevention requires both serious, immediate protection measures and a long-term strategy to combat the culture of intolerance and hate that has become so embedded in Egyptian society and in the government itself. It will be hard to change that culture. Every attack, every death, and frankly every insult to your basic human dignity make it harder. But I want to encourage you to continue to look for allies in the majority Muslim community, to build interfaith alliances, to advocate for true freedom of religion. Because here's what I know. Your right to practice your religion is only as safe as your Muslim brothers, your Jewish sisters, your Hindu fathers, your Buddhist mothers, your agnostic uncle, and your atheist aunt. In order for you or me to enjoy freedom of religion, everyone else must enjoy it as well. That's the only way it works. And the alternative is the risk of discrimination, repression, or even sectarian violence, which is exactly what we're seeing in Egypt. As a practicing Catholic and someone who has been inspired throughout my life by the Church's social justice teaching, I was heartened by Pope Francis's recent visit to Egypt, by his words and by the example that he set. The Pope's first stop in Egypt was at the Al-Azhar Mosque, where he embraced the Grand Imam and shared a platform with him. The Pope chose that setting to talk about the role of education, quote, to counter effectively the barbarity of those who foment hatred and violence, end quote. He talked about how respect for one's own identity and religious formation was a critical step to having the courage to accept differences, and how that would help the Christian and Muslim faiths walk together not as enemies, but as fellow travelers. Education, recognition and respect for differences, and finding ways to walk together, these are steps toward prevention. Solidarity of all in the face of attacks against any, that is a step toward prevention. The Pope did something else that is very important. He called out President El-Sisi for human rights violations. El-Sisi is presiding over a widespread crackdown on fundamental human rights that is closing off all space for peaceful dissent. Just this week, the government blocked digital access to more than 40 news sites, moving to eliminate some of the last remaining spaces for criticism and freedom of expression. I think by this point, all of us are aware of the well-documented reports of human rights violations that have occurred in the aftermath of the coup that put El-Sisi in power. Unlawful killings, torture, lack of due process, and suppression of civil liberties. In November of 2015, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I co-chair, held a hearing on the deterioration of the human rights situation in Egypt. Already at that point, the situation was so awful that many observers believe the government's own actions were fueling anti-government militancy and terrorism. In the name of fighting extremism, people were being radicalized. Since then, this concern has only deepened. Last week, the New York Review published a piece titled "Egypt, the New Dictatorship." It cites a young man who was imprisoned for a time with Muslim Brotherhood members who faced indefinite incarceration without trial, and who had been drawn to jihadism by their experience in El-Sisi's prisons. The young man reported that the guys who started to shift toward violence had the sole idea of revenge and breaking the regime that had deliberately killed, tortured, raped, and imprisoned them and their families and their friends. What the Pope did in Egypt was to remind El-Sisi that, and I quote, "History does not forgive those who preach justice, but then practice injustice. History does not forgive those who talk about equality, but then discard those who are different. No incitement to violence will guarantee peace, and every unilateral action that does not promote constructive and shared processes is in reality a gift to the proponents of radicalism," end quote. I really believe that this message must be taken to heart. I am very glad that you are here. It is important that you are here. It is important for the government of Egypt to understand that people in this Congress are paying attention to the fate of Christians and other minorities in their country. And I urge you to send a strong message that the path forward is that of respect and tolerance for difference and protection and promotion of human rights and the human dignity of all, in Egypt, here, and here at home as well. I'm just going to say, finally, as I mentioned, I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and I've been in that position now for many, many years. And, it continues to baffle me why in this world that there are people who exist solely to try to drive divisions within societies, to highlight their differences with other people, and where there are differences to attack and to vilify those people. I mean, I used to think that the older I got, the more everything would make sense to me. The older I'm getting, the more confused I'm getting, the more puzzled I'm getting, the more shocked I am that there are people who, again, justify their very existence by trying to show their differences, whether it's based on religion or ethnicity or gender, or I go right down the list. It is a terrible waste of time for people to dedicate their lives to that kind of division. I mean, we live in on this wonderful planet, and respecting one another and understanding one another could ensure that we live in a world that is at peace. And that is, to me, far more desirable than what we're dealing with right now. And so it's important for us to call out those who are hypocritical on the issue of human rights and hypocritical on the issue of religious tolerance. And it's important for us to continue to demand of this government here, our own government here in the United States, to do more, to try to heal these divisions around the world. It's not easy. It is not easy. But that is why I think it's important for you to be here. Not only to send a message to the government of Egypt, but also to remind people here in Congress that we have an obligation too. That yes, we have problems that are halfway down the block here in the United States that we have to deal with, but we also have to acknowledge the problems that are halfway around the world, because they have an impact on what happens here in the United States and to our people who are all around the world. So thank you for having me here today, and I hope you have a good conference. All the best.
Congressman,
Oh,
I have a question.
okay. Yeah.
What do you mean by sectarian clashes?
What do I mean by what?
Sectarian clashes.
You name any place in the world. I've been recently just came from a meeting on the issue of Iraq, and the various divisions based on not only politics but on religion that divide that country. I think where everybody continues to highlight their differences rather than what they have in common. That's an example of where there's sectarian divisions. I mean, when I was in Iraq the last time, I asked everybody, whether it was a Shiite or Sunni or the Kurds, what is the plan? What is the plan for political reconciliation in this country? And nobody gave me an answer. And I think we need to try to change that equation, because we all need to respect each other. We need to live in a country or this world with one another, because the alternative is this conflict and increased intolerance and discrimination. I mean, we're divided along a lot of different ways, and my plea is we got to find a way to heal those divisions. And I think, no matter what faith we are of, that's what our faith teaches us. I mean, we need to respect and love one another rather than to focus on what divides us. So that's what I mean.
In Iraq, you're 100% correct. Shia and Sunnis are sectarian clashes, but you used it referring to the attacks of the Copts in Egypt, and you said those sectarian clashes. It's not equal. When the majority attack the minority.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I don't care whether it's the majority. I mean, here's what I'm simply. I mean, and I think I was pretty tough on the Egyptian government in my speech here. No one's giving them a pass. I'm simply saying that as we move forward, that we need to try to figure out a way to win allies, amongst groups of people that may be in the majority, or that may be of a different faith, in order that we all stand together. I mean, again, I don't, that shouldn't be a radical idea. I'm not letting the government of Egypt off on this. I mean, I'm just simply saying that one of my critiques of my own government here is that I don't care whether it's a Democrat or Republican, that too often we rely on approaches that react to things rather than prevent things. And I'm not naive here. I'm just simply saying we need to spend a little bit more time on prevention, because it's reacting to things means that we're reacting to something terrible that's happened to people, and I'm not and I just think we need to be thinking a little bit more out of the box and more creatively.